This is such a compelling scheme, all three of them together. And what I enjoy most about them, I think, is that they feel that they're almost doable. We've seen so much creativity here. And the challenge, of course, is how do we deal with working with our current zoning resolution and our building code and seeing it in its next generation. And this allows me to think about that that might even be doable. But as you were saying, Deborah, I think what it all comes down to is density. And right now, both the building code and particularly the zoning resolution make that very difficult to work with. In that the zoning resolution really is more focused, in my view, on the envelope, FAR, what the envelope looks like and how it accommodates, how the site accommodates it. Whereas what we're talking about in smaller units is how do we increase density. Increasing density in the way the code is written now means we have more parking. But this, I'll let others talk about it, but each one of these lets us, as I said, visualize what could be. I love that.
Thank you. We're glad you like it.
Yeah, I mean, I would agree that, you know, it's great that you worked with the existing housing that's available. I was wondering if you could actually explain a little further the bungalow concept, because, you know, it was funny because in the previous presentation where Mr. Siegel presented the expansion of that single-family home, I was thinking it reminds me of, you know, the bungalow concept that we have in India. So I'd be curious to hear more detail about how many more units were existed. Is it a shared housing situation?
I'm going to let Isabel speak that.
So we were able to add 6 self-sufficient units, meaning, you know, each one has its own cooktop and full bathroom. Some of them have the single unit bathroom, you know, with the shower in the space itself. And we kind of started with that initial idea of, you know, investigating the typology and the flexibility of it, and then thinking, you know, if this is the dream house and you want to have some extra income, or maybe you have some, you know, potential tenants, how can we add it with retaining that kind of street connection where it still has the feeling of a single-family house and the appearance of a single-family house, but it has all of these hidden units, 6 of them, and still kind of is doable in the current zoning. And also adding the mews, which was actually an existing condition, but that we found in the neighborhood that we would like to also promote that on the scale of the block. But.
So you would be. Can you hear me all right? So you would be looking for a neighborhood for the local addition where you already had the mews, because when I looked at the project, I was going, well, that's great. You know, I like the fact you're calling it hidden. It's kind of dear to my heart. But I was just, but when I saw the picture, like I thought you had to create that mews, but you're going to find neighborhoods that have those already.
We augmented it. Yeah. It was half of the block existing, and if we were to array this house on the entire block, it would actually fit within the existing boundary of the city block.
And in the larger community, we would argue to add it within the code as encourage it as a possibility to take over from parking requirements.
So
it's
propositional. Maybe a house that was on the edge of the block where the mews wasn't existing could begin the mews, and then it could change over time, expand into
That's a nice idea.
Yeah, well, I think it was your idea. So it's like, and all these great additions and these dormers and all, I think the neighbors would be reasonably happy with all of that.
That was a goal, for sure. Context.
Because I think the topology fits the neighborhood. That's what's lovely about it. And I think what's important is that it could be, as you said, 1 through 6. So depending on your situation, whether it's extending your immediate family, and as Geraldine was talking about in the beginning, the issue that we're dealing with, which is a completely new issue for our culture, is this notion of this huge burgeoning aging population. And the alternatives now with an elderly parent are managed care that costs $5,000 a month, or a horrific situation, and there's very little that's in between. But I agree with you. I think the mews as dealing with the parking is something that happens in Montreal, for example. That's a very, very standard way of dealing with the same kind of density that we're talking about here. You know, I wanted, oh, go ahead, I'm sorry. I think one of the issues that all of these schemes bring up, not only your team's scheme, but the others, is related to handicapped access. And I know that politically speaking, we're not allowed to talk about this, but since this is a very theoretical conference, I think it's important to address, which is the fact that currently the ANSI standards, the national standards, which in good part are echoed by local New York City standards, are that all of the units in a new building have to be adaptable, and 5% of them have to be accessible, which means that, given the turning radius requirements and various other things, is that we are now making units larger than they ever were, in large part to accommodate a population that is really mostly ambulatory. And what's interesting is that just in researching for this conference, what we found out across the world, that people that are considered disabled, between 5 and 10% of them are in a wheelchair. So what we're doing is we're spending a considerable amount of money to accommodate a limited population. Again, I am, just based on my work, I am very, very much an advocate for designing for people who have a range of disabilities. But unfortunately, most of our money is going into those who are disabled only in a physical standpoint, whereas people who have mental handicaps, for example, are completely underfunded. So I like the idea of, sorry if there's an echo here, of allocating a certain set percentage for people who have a physical disability, which again could change over time. And then having the other units that would give us that opportunity to increase the density.
Yeah, right, yes. So, and for those in the audience, to expand that a little, what we did was we allocated some not adaptable, but actually accessible units by percentage in all our projects, but then therefore felt very comfortable making, you know, in the mini, a sleeping unit that's 120 square feet with kitchen and bathroom, where those conditions are not considered applicable at all. Kind of change the way the code works.
I was thinking the swing rooms, which I think is a great idea. I think that it would allow for flexibility. That, you know, there is a lot of transition that happens within families and communities as it is, and the gentrifiers and the local additions are already
Local stalwarts.
Okay. They're already sort of organically happening a bit as it is, but one concern would be that once people get into a residence, would they ever actually leave?
You know, that's really a fun discussion.
Yeah.
You could, in a rental situation, make it part of the lease. Right. That you start scripting the kinds of conditions, almost like the timeshare in the, but probably more complex,
right.
In the mini unit.
I think in general the idea with the shared, with the configuration and the variety of units that are in that building is that as families grow and change over time or contract, that the sort of associations between the apartments can change. And we, you know, had originally considered an idea of being able to connect between those two floors within an apartment, but, you know, in terms of the amount of space that's required for an interior staircase, we opted to give, you know, the greater privacy up for the smaller units on the second floor.
Yeah. Actually, I didn't point it out, but we do have 2 units that are connected through the fire stair. I mean, the fire stair is still a legal fire stair, but you can get from the inside of one unit on top to the inside of the unit below using that fire stair because, as Kate said, it was prohibitive.
Yeah.
And we also felt like connecting those the smaller units on the second floor of that sandwich to, rather than to necessarily one of the other apartments, but to connect them all directly to that main double height shared space was more important for the social interaction that we were trying to promote through the design.
Yeah. You know, I'm glad you mentioned the fire stair because I think there is somebody from the fire department here. And that is another very large issue that we have in terms of this interagency work that has to go forward. Obviously, the issue of 2 means of egress and fireproof construction and all of that is a key issue. But interestingly, a few administrations ago, the codes changed that we now have to have full sprinklers in all new housing construction. So we already have actually a very safe building type. Again, these are in new buildings. Renovations are a very different situation. And one thinks that there's a way that we could take that, in a sense, overprotected environment and already be able to increase density without having to add more means of egress. But again, that's part of what's interesting about what we're doing today, is to think about how all of these tentacles have to connect with each other.
Also, I like the remix there, where you cut a big donut out of the building. Lots of times developers think that's a bad idea, but we've done lots of work where you make the building smaller and it performs better, especially in housing where you have a big warehouse and you need light and air. And I've seen some wonderful loft projects where they like eliminate half the middle of the building. And you think, well, I just bought that big building and now I'm going to tear it all down, so it always feels funny, but it actually performs because then you're getting the higher rents on the smaller space.
Yeah. Yeah. You know, it's interesting that that project is sort of the New York that I remember my parents telling me about, where you owned your business on the ground floor and you lived up above. And then there was a stair and you ran up and down and you'd close at 5 o'clock, but if somebody came in, you could run down the stairs and deal with them. So it seems to me very doable.
Yeah.
Just even from a social standpoint, it's not only the interaction between the people that live there, but between the people who live there and who their customers are. And so you could keep manufacturing, instead of taking manufacturing areas and completely gentrifying them and taking their jobs away, keep the manufacturing on the ground floor and then live up above. Yeah.
The, and we were taking into account also the scale, the various scales that the new kinds of manufacture take place at, you know, where some of them are more artisanal, and you're gonna, you know, this already happens, you know, where you get a lot of craftspeople sharing what used to be a single manufacturing ownership. One very important thing about manufacturing districts that I truly believe, though, is that they have to be able to expand. They have to expand or die. Why it would be important, why this seemed like a very interesting site to us. And also, well, it's really a typology or a type of site that repeats itself. Most of the NYCHA projects have exactly this kind of surround, where there's a lot of manufacturing around them. Probably they were located there on fringes for reasons to begin with. And then there's more small scale, middle class, privately owned housing on another side near the public transportation. So that by looking at these as potential communities or areas of development, we'd be able to make them denser, add these new kinds of housing, but also create a fabric of existing manufacturing that could be maintained, so that that economy could be expand, because it really demands the ability to continually expand in the future, or else it will wither and go someplace else.
Yeah.
Let's see, I'll have a comment about the incremental construction. I've always been fascinated with Mexico and the way things are happening, and I've tried often to figure a way that works in the United States, and have discovered that it actually doesn't unless you're building with cash, and because there's so many reasons that you're not going to do it otherwise. But if you can put one of those dormers on for $80,000 and you can pick up $600 a month, then maybe it's worth it.
Yes, yeah. You want to, go.
I mean, just to add to that too, a homeowner of a single family house, I mean, why would you add it maybe for supplemental income? And you can just add what you can afford, you know, one part at a time, which is kind of the way home renovation works, usually, you know. Yeah.
But I do think the parking and the sprinkler are the biggest challenges to this kind of situation. At least in our work, that's been the challenge in looking at this. I was going to ask about the solar tower. Is that what it was? I mean, you know, because air and light is definitely a challenge.
It's just a cylinder with mirrored interior and a kind of dome that pulls light in, and it has a bend in it. And yeah, it was inspired by the probably non-usable chimney at this point. So,
And the only other thing is for us, and it's true, we see this as a real project, but we also can't help imagining building one of these kind of monster barnacle things from scratch. And it seems if we did so, it's the idea, and we saw in some of the Japanese examples of the section, which architects love, being under-imagined and underutilized as a way to connect people and space, but also to connect us to light and air and shadow and all those wonderful things. And that, so whether it's a real chimney or a hypothetical new kind of section of space that goes through the house, that's what was really interesting.